Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Torah study class. I'm seeing in the chat that folks are wishing Florine well. Florine, who is just recovering from a tumble, and Torah is a force in our tradition that we believe to be healing. So let's learn today for the healing of Florine, one of our beloved members. And for the healing that is so needed in the world right now, as we look out into the world, and so many are still suffering, so many countries are still racked by this ongoing struggle. So dedicating our Torah to the healing of all who need healing today. Okay, I have got quite a little piece for you today. The truth is, I had a whole class planned. I start thinking about it at the beginning of the week, and I put something together, and I will tell you, it was quite acrobatic. There were 15 texts there. We were going to jump across the Bible and make all these connections, and you're going to be so dazzled and impressed with our tradition, and maybe with me. But I last night I had a chavruta with my cousin, David. We were named for the same person. Who is the chazan over at Nephesh. Anyway, we studied this piece from the Mea Shiloach, one of the great Hasidic masters, and it's just so good that I just threw the class. We'll study that other thing maybe next year, but I just threw it away because we have to study this piece. It's just it's an exquisite piece of Torah. So that's what we're going to do today. What else? We counted the 39th day of the Omer last night, and we're moving towards Shavuot, and in our community we're moving towards gathering. We're going to gather for the first time this Shabbat in a limited way, and we're going to have a gathering on Shavuot, and more we're going to gather together in person. And I hope we'll still be gathering together in this way. Online as well, but maybe I'll start to see some of you in the flesh soon. Okay, so those are good things to think about as we bless our Torah study today. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here we're going to get right into it. Usually I'm more in the text of the Torah, and we see the connections ourselves. But today we're just going to dive right into this piece by the Mea Shiloach, and we'll kind of dip out a little bit when we need reference. But we're just going to try and take the hour to digest this one piece and its implications. And the implications, I think, are quite profound. Okay, who is the Mea Shiloach? Mea Shiloach is the name, great Jewish scholars are named after their book, are called after their book. So his book is called the Mea Shiloach, the waters of the Shiloach stream. But that's because Mei is Mem Yud, Mordechai Yosef Leiner of Ishbitz. He's the Ishbitzer Rebbe. Ishbitz is a town in Poland, and the Mea Shiloach I sometimes see as the kind of a transitional figure in Hasidic thought, which begins in the 18th century. The Mea Shiloach really is in the beginning, born in the 18th century, but really is teaching in the beginning of the 19th century, and is a kind of, so the 1800s now, and the Hasidic thought, this kind of mystical interpretive tradition we have, has matured now to a certain extent, and there's a new spirit in the air where the Hasidim had been sort of God obsessed above all. As the century turned, it was true in Jewish thought and so many other kinds of thought. There was a kind of psychological turn in the intellectual life of the Hasidic masters, which is to say there was a certain school that placed greater emphasis on what was going on inside of us. Maybe that was the real spiritual work rather than what was out there. So Mea Shiloach is part of that. The one other thing I'll just say, and we won't do a whole introduction of who he was today, but the thing that he is most known for, famous for, is that he is perhaps Judaism's greatest determinist. meaning determinism. All is predetermined. All is God. God controls everything. We don't really have control. God is in charge. And that's important. We're going to keep that theme in mind. In fact, the Me'ashilach is a controversial figure and got in trouble because there are certain passages where he seems to suggest that when we sin, that's God doing that. That's not us. So that's like, that gets a little wild there. But the point is, it's less a philosophical, God set the universe into motion. God is in charge of everything. It's more about your experience of the overwhelming power of God. And I think that is going to be part of what the Me'ashilach is dealing with today. But this is a Parsha class, and we're going to be doing Parshanut, and we're going to be looking at the text of trying to make sense of the text of the Torah. So I wouldn't, in this space, I wouldn't just bring you some beautiful theology without doing what the Me'ashilach is doing in this piece, which is really thinking about the text of the Torah. And the text of the Torah that we're dealing with this week is the end of the book of Leviticus. Two parshot that are usually lumped together, Bahar and Bechukotai. And Parshat Bahar, the second to last, penultimate Parsha in Leviticus, begins, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe Bahar Sinai. That's the name. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and said the following. And that's an interesting beginning because, we know about Mount Sinai. Why are you suddenly telling us about Mount? But somehow these laws that are given at the beginning of this Parsha were spoken to Moses on Mount Sinai. So there's something like grand about their announcement. But the laws themselves at the end of the book of Leviticus sometimes feel a little bit like just a kind of like a et cetera, miscellaneous like kind of lumping of extra stuff that Leviticus forgot to mention. We're like, it's not, there's like a jumbled set of laws, and then there's the Leviticus has a bunch of curses at the end. It's like it's a little chaotic. So part of what we're gonna just do is try to figure out what exactly is happening in these last parshot, and particularly in Parshat Bahar. And I'm just here, I'll give you one look at it before we go into the Me'ashilach. But here's Parshat Bahar. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, and the first thing that gets discussed there, grand language of Mount Sinai, but the first thing that gets discussed is what they call Shemitah. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath of the Lord. The land observes a Sabbath, which means that 6 years, for 6 years, you can sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. Okay, so this is the first institution that Parshat Bahar offers, is the institution of Shemitah, which is a 7-year cycle in which the 7th year is a non-farming year. You let the land lay fallow because the land is God's, it says, and because the land needs to rest too, like everything else. Now, of course, that seems like disaster. What does it mean to like not farm your land once every 7 years? And there seems to be a kind of a presumption that God will provide. The land will grow forth if you leave it in this way. There's been theories on like land fallowing and whether it's good for the land. I don't know anything about. My stepfather maybe can help out. He's here and he knows a lot about such things, but I don't know anything about that, so we can consider that. But the point is that we begin with this institution. Now, I'm going to take you into the Me'ashilach now, this Hasidic teacher, and he's going to mention this institution and a couple of other institutions that are mentioned in quick succession, and it's going to require another, say, few minutes of scaffolding here, and then hopefully we'll kind of crack this open into some really far-reaching theological claims, ethical claims. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. here is the here's the source sheet for today. Okay. And we're even going to have to dip into some like hardcore Kabbalah today, but don't worry, we'll just dip. just dip. It's a little morning dip into some hardcore Kabbalah. All right, so this is our source sheet. I put it into the chat, but I'll also just screen share it. And here the Mei HaShiloach begins, Mei HaShiloach, waters of the Shiloach, and begins right there at the start, just what we just read. Speak to the Israelite people and tell them, et cetera, that the land shall observe the Sabbath of the Eternal. Okay, here's what he says. The idea behind these three sections that appear here. There's Shemitah, that we just saw, the sabbatical year. Then the sabbatical year moves into, that's a 7-year cycle. Then there's a 7 times 7-year cycle. Every 50th year is called the Jubilee or Yovel. Okay, so the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, Dror Avadim Bayovel, the freeing of slaves in the Jubilee year. Okay, that's another, and I you know what, I might as well just show you that one because it comes very quickly. So here we are back in the 7-year cycle. I'm just sort of scrolling through that. And then all of a sudden it says, yeah, and then do that 7 times and you'll get to a 49 years. And then this is a beautiful couple of lines here. Then you shall sound the horn loud in the 7th month on the 10th day of the month, the day of atonement. You shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year, and you shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. And release or freedom is dror. In fact, there are modern Israelis named Dror because it's a beautiful name. Okay, so that's the Jubilee year. Every 50th year, all slaves go free. Okay, so every 7 years the land rests. Every 50th year, all slaves go free. And then the Mei HaShiloach says, and finally, rebit, charging interest. Now that's interesting because whenever we mention Shemitah, we end up mentioning Yovel. Whenever we mention the sabbatical year, we end up mentioning the Jubilee year because one flows into the other. But it's actually true, and it will become useful to the Mei HaShiloach, that the third major institution mentioned in Parshat Bahar is ribit. And ribit is charging interest. You may know that there's a prohibition on charging interest. Okay. I'll actually even show you that because why not? So like if I kept scrolling down, there are all of these laws of the Jubilee year, property being reassigned, and then there's not lending money here at interest. Okay, so that is, the Mei HaShiloach is right. Those are the 3 institutions that get mentioned up front: Shemitah, Yovel, and Ribit. And that's the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year. So sabbatical years let the land rest every 7 years. Jubilee year, free all slaves in the 50th year. And then Ribit, which is don't charge interest. I see my parents have a question. That's right. That's right. But it's like 6 years. Okay, it's just asking about my mom's just asking about the structure of the Shemitah. So it's 6 years of regular farming, and then in the 7th year you leave the land and you just let it grow, and the poor are allowed to come and take from the land, and you can eat from the growth of the land, but you don't work the land. Okay, so that's the every 7 years. Okay, and that happens 7 times every 7 years, and then in the 50th year, at the end, I guess, of the last Shemitah, you release all slaves, among other things, many other things. But that's what he's going to focus on. Okay, okay. So all right, so let's look back now. So those are the 3 institutions, and And the Mei Shiloach in some ways is just asking a basic Parshanut question, which is, what are these? Why does Parshat Bahar say, and on Mount Sinai there was this, this, and this? Shemitah, Yovel, and Ribit. What are these three institutions? And here he's going to give you his thesis statement at the outset, so we'll already have something to chew on. He says, the idea here is that the Holy Blessed One is warning Israel not to place their trust in any of those things that appear to people to be trustworthy. Okay? Shelo yasimu bitchonam b'shum davar hanireh le'enei adam sheyachol liftoach bo. Don't trust those things which it seems like you can trust in. Okay? Now, let's just pause here because I've been talking for a while. That already, does that make sense to you? That these institutions are, don't trust those things that you think you can trust. Why are these the things you think you can trust? I mean, I guess I'm already feeling like, oh, okay, the letting the land, you have to trust God in order to let the land grow. But what about the others? Noah, you want to help us out?
Yeah, though I'm still grappling with a part of it. I think I understand the interest part and the Yovel and somewhat of the Shemitah all being connected, because one's letting the land go free, one's with the slaves and people that work the land, and one is the exchange of money for goods, land, or whatever. But in not trusting it, it seems to be saying that we're supposed to think that all these people have ulterior motives for why they're either letting the land go, letting the people, the slaves go, or any of the other business things that happen with money, which seems counterintuitive, because if there's no trust between people, then there's no community, and if there's no community, nothing will get done, and everything's just anarchy and chaos.
Okay, great. So Noah's actually given us quite a lot here. First of all, helps us to begin to imagine, yeah, there's like systemic kind of like mapping here where there's an economy and there are workers and slaves and money and exchange and land, and you don't want to trust that whole system, Noah says. And there's a suspicion that the Torah seems to have, that I think Noah's or at least as the Mei Shiloach reads it, it's not just that you shouldn't rely on those things, but that the Torah suspects you of we tend to trust those. There's some theological problem, like we put our faith in those systems, right? And then Noah wonders, well, wait a minute, like, shouldn't we put our faith in those systems? Like, what? You don't put your faith in planting a seed in the ground? Like, this is an extreme. Don't trust any of those systems. I mean, farming, slavery, okay, like we've come to question that entire the entire system, the moral basis of that entire. But some of these other things, and what about interest, and why is interest bad? Okay, so there's more work to do here. Dages, I saw you just put something in the chat, a relinquishing of different forms of gashmiut. Do you want to explain what you mean by that?
Yes, that these all have to do with relying on bodies, relying on manifestations of whatever godliness is in the form of the year, in the form of money and the currency of that, and the form of the labor of people. That all of these structures, all of these bodies are physicalized, and therefore can become avodah zarah if we double down on seeing the compartmentalization of godliness into gashmias. Then maybe the Torah is telling us, no, put your faith in ruchnias.
Okay. Let me that's very, very sharp. And let me just parse out some of those terms. They just says gashmiut, physicality. These things are all represent forms of physicalness, including bodies themselves. And this is going to be, Dages is right on. This is going to be important language for us. Physicalness, and there's a danger, isn't that in some ways the core danger of our theology, that you're going to attribute divinity to concrete physical things, and that's a problem. So, we have to redirect to ruchniya, like spiritual things. Okay, that's exactly where we're headed. Florine, do you want to comment before we dive back in?
I believe that before we can do Tikkun Olam, we have to do Tikkun Nephesh first. And for me, the 50 of the Jubilee is the equivalent to the counting of the Omar Kabbalistically. In other words, it's a time to reflect and purify, and that we need to move back and go to our soul, and then go back to the world around us, whether it be farming or whatever it's going to be.
Good. So thank you, Florian, because there is a cycle here, a cycle that one moves through, 7-year, 49-year, as we're doing today. These days, counting through the Omer 49, the cycle suggests there's some process, and the process one might think of as a spiritual process, a process of purification, on some process of becoming ready for something, right? So how does this work? How do these systems work to keep us from trusting in things that we ought not trust in, and as Deja's into its physical things, especially, as Noah said, the whole system of our whole economic life, right? Okay, so here he goes, and this is going to be the hardest part of the class. Okay, like strengthen your brains, because now we're going to have to do a dive in, or a dip. We just said a dip into some Kabbalah, but we're not going to need to understand it fully for our purposes today. Suffice it to say that part of the style of Hasidic commentary is that Hasidic movement is born in the 18th century, 18th, 19th, 20th century movement. Part of the style is they would borrow terms and concepts from the earlier Kabbalistic movement of the 1600s and earlier, what we think of as classical Kabbalah. And they would borrow terms, and terms like tzimtzum, the contraction of the world, which you may have heard of, and then they would just use it in a different way, because tzimtzum just means contraction. So they would almost poetically borrow from earlier not Hasidic, Kabbalistic formulations. And we're going to see that exactly here. And the term, and we're not going to have to understand it, but I will show it to you inside just so you see where it comes from. The term, or the phrase, is Olam, Shana, Nephesh. World, year, and how do we translate Nephesh? But we're going to translate it body. World, year, and body is a triad that we find in ancient Kabbalistic literature. And the Me'er Shiloach is going to use it to explain as a framework. We're not going to need to understand it on a deep, but it's actually beautiful the way he uses it as a framework to explain each of these three things. So this is a little bit of a timeout Kabbalah lesson, and then we're going to come back into the Me'er Shiloach. So he says, these three things, Shemitah, Yovel, and Ribit, the sabbatical year, the freeing of slaves in the Jubilee year, and charging interest. These three things are Olam, Shana, and Nephesh. Here it is. Olam, Shana, and Nephesh. Now, I said Olam is world, or could mean universe. Shana definitely means year, although it could also kind of generally refer to time, the moving of time. And the most difficult to translate is Nephesh. Is the name of the shul, actually, where my cousin is the chazan, Nephesh. And sometimes we translate it as soul. Sometimes we translate that as self. Sometimes we translate that as life. And today, I think the best translation will be body, for some of the reasons that Dejas was already intuiting. But I think body is going to be the easiest way to translate Nephesh. Shmo'or me'od et nafshotechem. Guard very carefully your Nephesh. Could be your life, or your body. That's a commandment to protect your body. So there's one usage. But where's this idea? What? World, year, body? What am I even talking about? Well, I don't know what I'm talking about, because it's just a phrase that is found in one of the core texts of Kabbalah, and it is not a text that I am able to understand in any way. Okay, but it's the place where the Sfirot are mentioned, the divine emanations are first mentioned. It's called Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. And it was around in the Middle Ages already. Nobody knows who wrote it. The tradition says that Abraham wrote it. Okay, so it's like as if this is the core, earliest knowledge of the world. And it reads almost like poetry. It reads almost like physics. It reads almost like it doesn't read well. Let's just say it doesn't read easily. So here's the appearance of Olam, Shana, and Nephesh. Remember, we're on a little intermission here. So if you're suddenly feeling lost, this is the intermission. Sefer Yetzirah, there are many versions of it, but this is the one that the Gra put together. And just listen to the language of the Sefer Yetzirah. These are the three mothers, Aleph, Mem, and Shin. And from them emanated the three fathers, and they are air, water, and fire. And from the fathers, descendants, three fathers and their descendants, and 7 planets and their hosts, and 12 diagonal boundaries. I know, I bet some of you out there are like, no, I get this. I can, because there are certain patterns we can see in here. Like, oh, is this Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants? And then who are the three mothers? But they're letters. I mean, it's all very confusing. But in the middle of this, we have this phrase, a proof of this, a proof of I don't know what, but a proof of this, faithful witnesses in the world year body. Now, that in itself, I don't even know how to do the grammar there. What I wanted to say is world year and body are faithful witnesses to this, but it doesn't quite say that. It says a proof of this thing, faithful witnesses in the world year and body. It's not something I understand, and I'm not going to ask us to understand it right now, but there's the original formulation, world year and body. So that seems to mean something to the Kabbalists. There's something about that triad that's meaningful. And I'll just give you one Kabbalist's explanation of it. Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, one of the famous Kabbalists of the Tzfat period in the 1600s, he says this: we must begin by saying that these are the 3 dimensions of revealed physicality. This is Deja's language. Look at that. Hagashmi hamitgaleh. These are the 3 dimensions of revealed physicality. Olam, world, Shana, year, and Nephesh, body. And then this is especially cool. If you took the first letters of them, we refer to them as Oshan, or smoke. There's something happening there too. That's pretty cool. But wait, before we go there, does anyone understand any of this? I mean, does anyone understand the last piece of it? That's really what I'm asking. What is it? What would it mean to say what Moshe Cordovero says, that world, year, and body are the 3 dimensions of physicality? Does that make any sense to anyone? It makes sense to Dejas and to Matt. Matt, what do you think?
I can say that year is time, and that bodies are things that, and physicality is stuff that exists in time and changes through time. So it is, I can take that piece and say, I know what they're talking about. And if we're doing Kabbalah, then we're talking change and we're talking all that kind of stuff. But I see where year is. And I can then I'm going to jump. And so I know what world and body is if I want to say there is self and there is everything else. So the world is all of existence, all of creation, and body is me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got me in the world, and we change through time.
Okay.
Yes.
That's great. That's a great job. So what we have here is time, and then, dare I say, like outer matter and inner matter, right? Me and the world is like sort of, that's a primary binary I'm working with. I have a self, and then there's everything around me, but it's all the physical stuff. It's me, it's the world, and then it's matter moving through time. It's all the dimensions of physicality. Okay, I think that's a great first pass. Anybody want to offer more nuance to this?
Well, I'm thinking this is sort of a very understanding of some physicists, Einstein's theory of relativity and like the space-time continuum, as where all bodies or selves, souls, whatever, that are existing in the space of this world, our souls may be existing as well in the space of the next world, and we're all interacting in this plane in the realm of time as well. I don't know about Olam Haba. Maybe it also exists there, but it's
okay. I think we're getting too far up. That is, these speculations are exactly right. There's a way in which we start to talk about concepts that almost feel like they have parallels with modern physics. And indeed, there are a lot of conversations in Jewish study around, and frankly, in the study of physics, around how mystical systems of thought might intersect with modern physics concepts. But I'm such an amateur in both of those things that it's not even worth moving forward here. Maybe someone else can make these connections, but not I. So let's just pause here, and things are getting very far out, but let's make them easy again. Because that's the framework: world, year, body. That's the framework that the Mea Shiloach is going to use. Florine, you're shaking your head. Are you in?
I'm really taking an opposite viewpoint. I'm going from right to left. And so I see it in two ways. I see it starting with the Nephesh. I see it as the 5 levels of the soul, moving upward, but in this sense, I'm moving right to left. And the other thing I see it, if I go right to left, I see it as the soul and the body through the movement into the world to come.
Okay, so again,
way out of reality.
Way too high level for us. Like if Florian and Noah are starting to play around in the stratosphere. So we're just going to pause this here. The Mea Shiloach's use of these terms is actually going to be far simpler and more straightforward. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so now we've got a system. We've got a triad. We've got a system that we can use. Remember what we're doing to analyze the appearance of these 3 systems, Shemitah, Yovel, and Ribit, as parallel to Olam, Shana, and Nephesh, and they're all meant to make the case that we are not to place our trust in any of the things that appear to be trustworthy, and now those things are Olam, Shana, and Nephesh. Don't trust world, don't trust year, and don't trust soul, self, life, body. Okay, so let's see it. And the first one, I think, is the easiest to intuit. Here's Shemitah, because, okay, here's part 1. The purchase of fields and vineyards is an acquisition that people have in the world that they can trust. So to counter that instinct, and that's my translation, neged zeh, against that. Okay, so to counter that instinct, the blessed God commands Shemitah, which means that people place their trust in them and must see that they belong to God, meaning them, the fields and vineyards. People trust those things, but people have to see that they belong to God. For in the Shemitah year, people do not recognize any ownership in the things they own. It's a funny formula here. Ein la'adam shum hakarat kinyan bekinyano. A person doesn't recognize any actual ownership in the things that they own. It becomes clear that the earth belongs to God. Okay, that's step 1. And frankly, I don't think it needs a lot of commentary. Right? Do we basically understand that? It's just what's important is now Shemitah represents for him the world. And what is the world here? Like land, the actual globe, like stuff, produce, property that is the goods that I have and trade in the world. And I have to recognize that those goods are, now, there's a little bit of conflating of ideas here. as I'm reading it. It belongs to God. It belongs to God, not me. But more importantly to the Mei Shiloach is, I can't trust those things. Why can I not trust those things? Doesn't the produce come out of the ground? I can trust that. Anyone have a sense of what he means by you cannot trust that, or you should not trust that? Yeah, Hal.
I think you can't assume that it's automatic. It takes some intercession, I guess in this case, divine, but you just can't assume that it will happen automatically. And farmers rarely do. So.
Exactly right. That's very well put. Yes, produce comes out of the ground, but it is unpredictable. It's precarious. The Talmud calls farming an act of faith, because you have to recognize, even though you are farming, you can't really. That's not your God. You can't. That's not your stronghold. You can't trust the earth will always provide. The earth won't always provide. You have to trust in God. Okay, so that's a good first. You see how that movement happens, where you don't trust in the substance of the world, in things, produce, market goods, right? If I were to extend it, don't trust in those things. Don't trust in your job. Don't trust in your income. Don't trust in the land. Trust in God. Okay, that's step one. Step two is much more interesting and a little trickier to figure out. And the Mei Shiloach is going to jump, like in order to keep his system world year, he's going to jump to the third, not Jubilee, but Ribit, the charging of interest. So look at what he says here. Okay. And to counter the instinct that people have to trust in time, that is, when they trust that they will amass wealth by charging for time. She'asef hon michir hazman, which they do when they take ribit, when they take interest. The Torah says, in order to counter this, the Torah says, do not take from him an advance or an extra, piece when you loan. For the essence of ribit is charging a price for time. As it says in the Talmud, the general rule of ribit is any profit that comes by waiting is forbidden. Now that's interesting. What's the problem? You can imagine that it's like, oh, it's not fair. It creates a vulnerable economic relation. There are many reasons we might critique interest, but what does it mean to say the point of not getting into the interest on the loan that I'm going to make over time is to keep you from trusting in time as a phenomenon, because you're not supposed to charge for waiting, for moving through time. What does that mean? Why is that important? Allison Goldman.
I think it's because you could just take time for granted. You know what I mean? That maybe if you think that time is something that is guaranteed, then that might compete with your trust in Hashem, because Hashem should be the only thing that's guaranteed. Okay, good. That's great. That seems to me like certainly one level of this, which is that, do you think that, you can trust that you will have, if you plan things out, if you plan a business that yields in 3 years, that you can trust that and just wait for the 3 years and make your money at the end? Like, don't think that it's all, there's a plan, an economic plan that you can move through that will yield results. Okay. But I feel like let's keep going here, because I think there's more going on here. It's the actual system of, I'll give you money now, but you're going to give me money later with a little bit extra. And there's something that the Mei Shiloach sees here and says, there's an insight here that our tradition doesn't want you making money on the passage of time. Why? What is that about? What is that about? I mean, I'll tell you what I'm thinking about, which is all of the ways. I mean, our whole freaking economy right now is structured around this sort of reckoning. Buying futures, hedge funds, hedging is to bet on the fluctuations of the market. And you can bet for things and you can bet against things. You're just betting.
That's our economic system right now in some ways. Ribit is like a very personal version of it, right? If I wait, you'll have to give me back extra. I haven't done anything. Part of the point is I haven't done anything. I just gave you money and now I'm going to get back. There's something wrong with that whole system of speculation. Marianka.
I just wonder if you charge interest for the future, you're kind of taking away that person's time, right? You're taking away his labor or creativity. It's that person's time. They will be creative, they will be productive in their time, but you're taking that time away from them as interest. I don't know if I'm making it clear.
That there does seem to be a connection there. As we see these various forces as interconnected versions of physicality. So yes, we can imagine that a person's time is the physical labor that they can invest and their life force. So in some ways, hold that thought because we're going to get to it with bodies. Okay, but yes, there's a relationship between bodies laboring in time. Now let's take one more thought here from Hal.
So, I mean, what strikes me about this is that it is commodifying time. It is changing the relationship between the borrower and the lender and kind of reducing it. So instead of being this rich interaction with all kinds of dimensions, you're helping someone, there's gratitude, et cetera, it reduces it to a very simple, limited monetary meaning.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. That's a helpful phrase, to commodify time, to turn time into an object of value that will yield benefit for you instead of being, I don't know, the vehicle through which we have an existence. Now it's like you're commodifying it, and you're commodifying everything. You're commodifying the land, you're commodifying time. I think that's part of it, is to commodify the world around you and to see the world as objects of value. And that is part of the trusting in things that you should not be trusting in. I want to add to that, though, that I also think part of what's happening here is that it's almost like, it really is theological. It's almost like playing tarot cards, casting fortunes, right? Like there's something about trusting in fate and fortune and the way that time will work in your favor as a force, almost like time becomes, as it has been, deified. And like, if you prayed to the gods of time, you would get what you want. You're like, you're consulting fortune. And that also seems to be a problem here. Okay, so don't trust in the land, the world, the physical objects. Don't trust in time, the fluctuations of the market, of history, of benefit that will eventually accrue to you. And then finally, don't trust in, and here I think is the most striking piece here, and to counter the instinct that people have to acquire the bodies of slaves. This is why I think bodies is the best translation. Nefashot avadim, or the lives of slaves, but to acquire the bodies of slaves so that they can trust in them, so that people can trust in that acquisition and use them for all of their needs. To counter this, the blessed God commanded that we free all slaves during the Jubilee. This is so that people see that one cannot own bodies, and so one must send them free. And even while they are slaves, the blessed God commands that one not work them excessively. And that too is so that they understand that another person's body does not belong to them. Now, that's just good anti-slavery Torah right there. It's worth seeing. Although, you know, the anti-slavery thrust in Torah is at this point not too satisfying to us, right? Because it allowed for slaves, doesn't seem to conceive of a world without slaves, but the point is that the Torah has these systems of eventually releasing slaves, and even while someone is, I might say, indentured servant, but okay, so let's use the word slave. Even while someone is, there's protections that they can't be overworked. is not what we would today call a perfect system, but there it is. And the Mea Shiloach is taking from that. You cannot own a person. Thank God he says that. Like, it's great to see a Jewish thinker say that very explicitly. But for our purposes, I also want to ask, what does it mean to trust in slavery? To trust in the acquisition of human beings and human bodies and human labor as something that you can trust in and you will be able to rely on. What is that instinct? Is that an instinct? What does that mean? Okay, we'll just hold in case anyone who hasn't spoken yet wants to jump in.
It means you're okay with enslaving people, I think.
Means that you're okay. You justify the system of slavery for the purpose of your own, so you can trust in it, so you can rely on it in order to satisfy your needs. Others? Okay, no. Marlene, hello.
I think the word trust is really interesting here because we think of trust as such a positive word. And this is making us think about trust as the sort of manifestation of materialism and the commodification. So the word trust is confusing as it comes in, and we really have to think about not just I don't see it as just putting our trust in God, but putting our trust in our highest moral values and not simply on the materialism, even though we need the land to live and we need each other and we need the dignity of labor, to use Sherrod Brown's term, but we can't, we have to trust our better selves rather than trusting the commodification.
Yeah, great. In other words, you can put this into like in very stark, like it's God or it's physicality. But Marlene is saying, I think rightly, that there's some assumption that Mea Shiloach says that you're going to have to believe in something. You have to rely on something. You're going to have to trust something in this world. And the question is, what do you trust? Do you trust systems which are inherently commodifying and exploitative and physical and dependent on the vicissitudes of fate and time? Or do you trust higher principles? Are you willing to trust something like, the land doesn't belong to me. People don't belong to me. That can't be because I'm just a little being and there is a God above me. Like that, do you trust that? Okay. Kathy.
No, I think this is interesting what Marlene was saying about the word trust. And I wonder whether it is a kind of it's a kind of taking for granted. That's a form of trust that has a kind of less sort of a positive connotation or whatever, that and that as well as sort of trust as faith. And what really strikes me about the Nephesh part is that I usually think of Nephesh as being soul, but in fact that it's very much body in a very specific sense. Avi Havivi told me that it went back to the root for esophagus, that it's really the throat, the esophagus, and that in a way it's like taking breath for granted, actual physical breath, not, and so that it's that kind of that trust in breath, and in fact you can't take it for granted. And I've really been struck, especially this year, the whole George Floyd, that was his Nephesh, that was being cut off, and so it's almost like taking life for granted in a way that he's cautioning against.
Yeah. Wow. Profound as usual, Kathy. That's right. It makes me wonder actually whether body is the best translation. That the reference that you're giving us, right? The Psalms say, call out to God because the water has come ad nephesh, up to my neck. The water is up to my esophagus. Like there's There's some language there, and it makes me wonder if maybe like life breath or life is it's world that you don't trust in, it's time, and it's also life that you don't trust in, or at least a certain version of life. I mean, I think I saw in the chat someone said all you can trust in is death. Like, we can't actually rely on taxes. And slavery is the most commodified instance of taking a life, a body, and just using it as a product. But think about all of the other ways that we manipulate and exploit other human beings and their lives, and our own bodies and lives. Think about all of the ways that we're controlling and using and trying to extract labor from, and trying to extract social capital from, and exploiting the life, the actual physical life of somebody. That's the thing that we think we can use people's life force as a way of having something we can rely on in the world. Okay.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please. Yes.
And that also that Nephesh, I always think of as being tied to breath, and obviously the breath, but it's also just any kind of it's food, it's water, it's everything goes through our Nephesh, the esophagus, and so it kind of ties back to the Shemitah too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all as Noah wisely said at the outset, all of these systems are interconnected, right? We talked about it through a scientific paradigm, like matter and time interconnected, but labor and time and bodies and land and all these are this is like, this is a Marxist vision of the world, right? Like, these are the forces of our world that we live in, right? And the Mei Shiloach is saying, don't trust those things. And I'll just give you the obvious conclusion that he comes to. So the blessed God commands that these three mitzvot, so that it becomes apparent that the world and the year and the body are not things that a person should place trust in. For God is the only thing a person can trust. Now, the real question is, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to trust in God? Like, what would it mean to trust in God? I don't know that we have 5 minutes left. So I don't think we know if we could ever answer that question, but there's some other kind of trust. Because remember, you have to rely on something, not any of those things, but God. Trust in God, not those things. So what does that mean? I want to leave that question hanging there, but I want to turn to Jen. Who had her hand up from before.
Yeah, and this whole issue of trust and reliance, and that term kind of makes this hard for me to step through, but I'm thinking about the metaphor of smoke, the acronym of smoke, and the idea that smoke is, right, it's an epiphenomenon of fire, right? It doesn't exist in and of itself or on its own, and it's very, like, it's immaterial. You can just wave right through it and not really take it all that seriously. Just like all of these things that we're talking about, life and matter and time, are epiphenomenon, are being continually produced by God. And if you're looking at them only as themselves, then you're going to miss its source. You're going to miss what's really happening underneath them. And maybe these issues even of ethical actions, of treating bodies with respect, of understanding our place with respect to them, require seeing the fire that's fueling them underneath. And that's what they are really created from.
Ooh-wee, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. That was great. I mean, I'm so glad, first of all, for the callback to the smoke there. World, year, and life, body, whatever. Like, if you form the acronym SMOKE, and I was already thinking there's something kind of intriguing about that. Like, the very most physical things are actually just like smoke. But what Jen says is even deeper, which is that smoke comes from somewhere. You're not seeing the fire. You're not seeing the fire, the real animating force. And that's part of this too, and it's part of it's a basic Jewish claim. Yeah, there's a beautiful sun up there, but the sun comes from somewhere. The world comes from somewhere. Your life comes from somewhere. There's something higher than all of this. Okay, so that's beautiful. Okay, there's one last move that the Mei Shiloach, we basically have it. Okay, this is his, I think we've done great work seeing these three tiers. And I will say, as I said at the outset, there's something, what I love most about this is that it's real parshanut. He's not just spouting theology. He's trying to explain what is Parshat Bahar doing when it gives us these three systems, one after another, and announces them as, this is from Sinai. He's saying, no, these systems are a way that God gave us to realize that our physical world and all of the things of our commerce and capital and labor and slavery and exploitation, those are not things that we should build that we should hang our existence on. Okay, one last move though, and it's so interesting. It's almost like a postscript here, because he then points to, okay, this is what I want you to believe, but then he points to a certain kind of anxiety that comes, when we try to reorient ourselves in this way. And here's the anxiety, and I just think it's so insightful, and it's amazing that he closes on it. He says, and that is why, just after these sections, they all took place, remember, in chapter 25 of Leviticus. Just after these sections, the Torah concludes with, I am the eternal your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan. Okay, that's true. Here, I'll show you. There it is. Don't lend him money. And then the very last thing in that section is, I am the eternal your God who took you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan. Now, there's a little bit of a kind of a homiletic, he's gonna explain the deeper meaning of this. But why does it say that? So that it will not seem to a person that their influence in the world has diminished as a result of having been forbidden these things. All right, now think about that for a second. The anxiety is, you think, if I tell you, you can't rely on your fields, you can't rely on your markets and commodities, you can't rely on exploiting other people. If I take all those things away from you, a person starts to think, yeah, but like, what am I going to have any impact in the world? I don't have any stuff. You're just asking me to just sort of trust in God. I'm going to be a nothing. I'm going to be like just wandering the streets. You're asking me to relinquish everything. That's very nice and lofty sounding, but it gives me fear that I will cease to exist. Does that make sense to you? It makes sense to me. That if you take all of those things, my job and my status, my car, my house, yeah, I know those things are just vapor, but like, what am I without them? You just want me to just be, meditating on God? That's all? I'll be nobody. It's an interesting anxiety. And here's what he says is the answer to that. And it's a poetic reading of the Egypt and Israel. That's why he says, it says, I am the eternal, your God who took you out of Egypt. Meaning, Egypt is the language of constriction. So meaning those benefits which do not come through holiness, all the things we've been talking about, are actually narrowness and constriction. All the things, all the physical things, the benefit, the wealth that you gain from those things actually constrict you. Whereas to give you the land of Canaan means the benefits that the blessed God bestows upon us come in holiness, and so we can expand through them. And so we can litpashet b'hem, expand through them. For the blessed God transmits benefits in holiness without any constriction. Again, the language for constriction is the same as language of Egypt. Okay, we're out of time, and I've just sort of, I don't know if I understand this, but there's quite an intriguing final thought, which is, lest you think that stripping you of all of these commodities, all of this physicality, will leave you without any being at all. No, don't worry. Those things were the things that constricted you, that held you tight, that choked off your neck. You were attached to those things, all right? More money, more problems. And if you can trust in God, don't worry that you won't have any existence. On the contrary, your existence expands, becomes infinite. Now, what does that mean? I leave it for you to turn over. But we'll have to close for today. And I hope you enjoyed that. And I will see you next week. Thanks for your Torah, everybody.